Hi, my name is Jason Koff, and I'm a professor of agronomy and soil science at Tennessee State University. I'm going to be talking about soil health and some of the main principles that are important for soil health and why soil health is important. So, first off, why it's important. First, we've got a growing population. We know that anywhere between 9 and 10 billion people are expected around the middle of the century. And so, what we need to do is we need to increase our food production by 70% in order to be able to feed all of the people that are in the world. At the same time, we've lost a lot of prime farmland, particularly in the US, due to development. And so, what we end up with is having to grow more on less land. So, we want to make sure that the soil is as healthy as possible so that it can continue to sustain us for many years to come and provide high yields to be able to increase that food production. So soil health, the main definition is that it's the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And so soil health and the soil itself provides a number of important functions when we're talking about growing a plant or engaging in agricultural production. These are all really important things, and they all can be affected by the health of the soil. So we want to think of soil as a living factory, and basically the workers in that factory are macroscopic and microscopic organisms. And what we're doing really when we're thinking about soil health is we really want to keep these workers happy. We want to provide the right food, water, and shelter for them so that they can thrive and engage in the activities that we'd like for them to do. Now, when we're doing this, we need to think about certain management activities that can have a benefit or a detriment to soil health. And so these are some of the things that I'll be talking about. So something to keep in mind is we know certain ecosystems are, producing a lot of biomass, such as the prairie and the forest ecosystems. And why are they doing this? Because they have very little human disturbances taking place. But then also there's a whole lot of variety. There's a whole lot of diversity out there with respect to plant material. And so these are some of the things that we're trying to work towards when we're talking about soil health. So another good example is looking at this continuum here, where on the left hand side we've got kind of our agricultural system. It's a very simple system. A lot of times, maybe there's one or two crops being grown. There's a lot of human inputs that are involved to kind of keep things going. Whereas on the far right side, we've got something that's kind of reached this steady state system where there's very few disturbances. There's a lot of good ecological services, and there's a lot of good biomass being grown. And so we don't necessarily expect our agricultural systems to move all the way to the right hand side, but we want to try to move that needle a little bit so that we're not dealing with such simple systems. And that's what soil health and thinking about soil health is all about. So one of the other things that's important to keep in mind is that our soil carbon content is very low because of all the tillage that we've done in the past and other sorts of agronomic practices. And so we've got an opportunity to actually build up that soil and bring it back up to where it was. And in doing so, we can really make that soil a lot healthier, a lot more sustainable and productive at the same time. So then RCS has come up with these 4 soil health principles. And so you can see them identified here. We've got minimizing disturbance, maximizing soil cover, maximizing biodiversity, and maximizing presence of living roots. And so the left-hand side of that really focuses on feeding the microbes that are in the soil. And the right-hand side is really about protecting the habitat for the microbes, but then, of course, protecting the soil itself. And so I'll talk about these. The first part that I'll talk about are minimizing disturbance and maximizing soil cover. So there's a number of things that we want to be able to attain when we're talking about minimizing disturbance and maximizing soil cover. We want to be able to maintain the soil aggregates that are there. We don't want the soil to just fall apart when it rains. We want to be able to reduce erosion, of course. We don't want to lose that important topsoil. We also want the soil to be able to provide a buffer when it comes to temperature, and also when it comes to evaporation, and then maintaining or increasing that soil organic matter, which is related to that carbon that I was talking about. So when we're talking about minimizing disturbances, it really focuses on those aggregates, preventing them from being destroyed or broken down. And so there's three different types of disturbance that we can think of that can cause some of these issues to occur. They're physical, chemical, and biological. And so on the physical side, the biggest one is tillage. And so tillage can have a lot of negative impacts on the soil. You can see all those that are listed here. Thankfully, in Tennessee, we do a lot of no-till, and so that's a really good thing for the health of our soils. When we're talking about tillage, like I said before, we're talking about those soil aggregates breaking down, and so this is a good micrograph that kind of shows what it looks like at the microscopic level. So the soil on the right is really has been under a lot of tillage. There's not really any pore spaces. There's not really any area where air or water can really get into and flow through. Whereas the soil on the left, there's a lot more airspace that you can see. And so tillage also has an effect on microbial activity. So under a conventional till system, the soil respiration increases significantly under that first tillage. You're really breaking apart a lot of the aggregates that are there, making the organic matter readily available for decomposition. It provides more places for the microbes to decompose that organic matter. And so you have this huge flush, this huge increase that you see on this graph. Whereas under the no-till system, it's more spread out across the entire growing system, which is what you want. If you were to think of this graph and think of, rainfall, you wouldn't want all the rainfall to be, so high and intense in one part of the season and then nothing the rest of the time. You really want it distributed evenly throughout that growing season. And it's the same case with soil respiration. And this is just another example of, the differences when we have kind of that real stable system identified by the forest here as compared to a regularly tilled system that you see on the right-hand side. They definitely look different. They have different organic matter, soil organic matter contents. And when, they interact with water, they behave differently. You can see on the left-hand side, those aggregates are stable underwater, but for the tilled system, they really fall apart. And so that's really what we don't want. We want them to be as stable as possible. Also, when we're talking about physical disturbances, traffic on the field can also create some physical disturbances with relation to compaction, especially if you're out there when it's really wet. That's going to create a lot of compaction and compacted soils. So now biological disturbances, there's a couple of examples here. When we don't have any diversity, that's a biological disturbance because the roots of each plant is going to exude a certain type of carbohydrate or a certain group of carbohydrates. And those are going to, be needed by a certain type of microbe. And so if you've only got one species being grown, then you're limited to very few carbohydrates that are being given out by the roots. And so very few different types of microbes that are out there. On the flip side, if you've got a diversity of plants, you've got a diversity of carbohydrates in the soil and then a diversity of microbes. And that's really what you want, to be able to interact with the plants, to be able to break down different types of organic matter for nutrient purposes for the plants and those types of things. And then overgrazing is another example of a biological disturbance where the soil is exposed. And so, of course, you can have soil erosion. You can have weeds taking over when the plants are overgrazed. And then, of course, you can also have a monoculture out there as well. Similar to our croplands in the pasture systems, you can also have some single species being grown, and that can have an impact. this is an example of overgrazing. You have, it grazed down to, to the roots essentially, and the plant can die, and then you have soil exposed, and then you can have weed seeds that germinate, and then they start to kind of take over that field. And so that comes with a whole host of things that we want to try to avoid. And then again, those monocultures are an issue, not just for promoting weeds, but also invasive species and creating biological imbalances. Now, when it comes to chemical disturbances, we're really talking about pesticides and fertilizers and their over application. So with pesticides, they don't usually target a specific organism. They usually target a lot of different microbes that are out there. And so you are going to end up killing some of the beneficial organisms as well as the ones that you don't want. And then pesticides, of course, simplify. You're going to have a reduction in your diversity that's out there. And one of the reasons is that it can restrict your crop rotation depending upon the label. What you can grow after that, that's going to be restricted. And then, of course, also with cover crop diversity, if you're growing a cover crop, then you're going to have to be careful, which ones you grow and which types and those kinds of things. When it comes to fertilizer, if we over apply fertilizer, we can actually short circuit some of the natural symbiotic relationships that exist between bacteria and fungi and then their plant hosts. And so usually that relationship is something where the fungi or the bacteria are small enough to get into areas that roots can't access. And so they can provide things like water or nutrients to the plant. In exchange, the plant provides carbohydrates from photosynthesis to those microbes. Now, if you've got too much fertilizer, then the plant's not going to need those relationships. And so the plant's not going to need to give carbohydrates to any of those microbes because it's already got what it needs. And so it can really break down some of those natural relationships that are out there. Also, bacteria and fungi need certain nutrients as well, just like plants do. And so that can actually help those populations to grow in the soil, and then they can go on to break down a lot more soil organic matter and release the carbon to the atmosphere, where we want that to stay there because it provides a real benefit for the soil. And then, of course, excess amount of nutrients can be leached, or in the case of nitrogen, you can have denitrification. And then a lot of the fertilizers, of course, are salts, and so that's going to potentially increase the soil salinity as well. So one of the good things, that we can try to do for the soil is to plant cover crops. And so we'll talk about that when it comes to diversity and increasing those living roots. And we're also providing that soil cover. So the soil cover can be plant residues, but it can also be cover crops. And so there's a number of different things that providing a soil cover can do for the soil. And it's really important and useful for enhancing soil health. And more is always better. We're talking about diversification. So more varieties of different types of plants, whether we're talking about crop rotations or whether we're talking about cover crop blends. And then also the more cover you can get on the soil is better as well, to help prevent any sort of erosion or those types of things. So with cover crops, it really helps to get that organic matter in the soil. You're getting additional roots, you're getting additional organic matter that ends up in the soil rather than, being decomposed and entering the atmosphere. And so on the left-hand side, we've got maximizing biodiversity and living roots. And so there's a whole host of things that we're looking at achieving on this side as well. Breaking those disease and pest cycles by having that diversity that's out there, stimulating change below ground diversity. So that's what I was talking about with the carbohydrates. Increasing soil organic matter is always good because organic matter provides a lot of benefits for the soil. breaking up clays, reducing compaction, holding on to water, providing nutrients. There's a whole host of things. And then, of course, increasing nutrient cycling is going to be important, enhancing plant growth, and then increasing predator and pollinator populations through the use of those different types of crops that are out there, whether they're cover crops or it's a crop rotation. And so I already talked about this where, you've got different types of carbohydrates that are there that are going to support different types of microbes. And that's really important when we're talking about crop diversity. Also with crop rotation, that can break up the pest and the weed cycles. And so also it can help to affect the organic matter. And so you can see in this graph, continuous corn. So this is over a period where we're doing a lot of tillage. So organic matter decreases for all of them. But for something like continuous corn, it decreases more than if you have other types of rotations that are in the system. And that, that's part of that organic matter buildup that we can get. So adding diversity with cover crops is important. I've mentioned that a couple of times already. It provides a lot of good functions for the soil, not just feeding the microbes, but of course providing that important cover. And so there's a little bit of a difference. I mentioned that crop residues can definitely provide some protection from the soil, from erosion and those types of things. But then also cover crops can do that and more. They can also have those roots that are in the soil that can continue to feed the microbes that are there. And then, of course, those roots are going to provide organic matter to the soil as well. So when it comes to cover crops, there's a lot of different types that are out there, and they all decompose at different rates depending upon how much carbon there is compared to nitrogen. So this is kind of a table looking at some of these different things and comparing them to manure and other things. So what we really want to do is get something that doesn't decompose too slowly or too quickly. And so we've got something like rye, which has a lot of carbon. It's going to take a long time to decompose, as opposed to hairy vetch, which has a lot of nitrogen in it, and it's going to decompose a lot faster. But if you have a blend of those, then you've got a nice mix where it balances out that carbon nitrogen ratio, and it makes it more of a steady decomposition. And so these are just some examples of different types of cover crops. These are those for warm season. We've got some different grasses and some different broadleaf cover crops that are identified here. There's a number that are identified by the NRCS. They've got a list of different things and different types of blends that people can use. And then these are the cool season cover crops, both the broadleaf and the grasses as well. There's other types of cover crops, like legumes are really important for adding nitrogen to the soil. So there's definitely some others, but these are some of the common ones that folks think about when they're looking at engaging in cover crops. And mixing is always, blending different types together is always a good idea. And so again, that species diversity, here's another example of how that diversity actually increases the plant biomass. The more species you get, the higher the plant biomass in a given area. And then also just the root mass itself. Compared to some of our cash crops like corn and soybean, that rye and hairy vetch cover crop example that I gave before, that produces such a high amount of root mass in the soil that you're really going to be able to, break up some compaction potentially, but also add a lot more organic matter to the soil. And then growing those living roots from those cover crops, they can provide a whole host of benefits that you see here. Of course, feeding the soil microbes, adding organic matter, being able to provide that biodiversity that's important in these ecosystems. So there's a number of different things that can be really useful in improving soil health. And so that's kind of it, kind of a brief discussion of soil health and these soil health principles and what they mean and how we can kind of start thinking about being able to enhance our soil health from where it is today to be able to make it more sustainable and more productive. So thank you very much.